Hey, do you teach yoga? Have you ever trained to lead yoga classes, to be a yoga therapist? Have you ever owned a yoga studio? Maybe even just wondered what it was like for the women and men up there in front of the room on their mats, leading you through endless Surya Namaskars, down dogs, and pranayamas galore? Well, these are their stories, and mine. I'm Rebecca Sebastian, a 20-year yoga teacher, 10-year yoga therapist, yoga studio owner, and co-founder of a yoga-focused nonprofit. I've done a lot in the yoga world over the last 20 years, pretty much everything except had a water cooler. You know, a place to share stories, talk about struggles, successes, and find other people who do the same thing that I do. Welcome to Working in Yoga, a podcast and substitute water cooler for yoga folks to connect and build community, to share our unique profession, our challenges, and our journeys with the world.
Hey friends, welcome to Working in Yoga. So this week is part 1 of 4 different continuing conversations that I'm having on the podcast. Most of these episodes I recorded before the summer, and I'm just now getting around to publishing the incredible content that these very generous guests have contributed to our ongoing topics and conversations. There are 4 very different subjects we're talking about in this mini-series. This week, perhaps, but not for certain, is going to be the most contentious. The topic is licensure in the yoga space. When I was doing my series on leadership, there were a ton of great conversations regarding licensing around yoga and yoga therapy. For the most part, though, everyone felt the same way. They were all decidedly anti or against license of any kind. This is especially relevant to the yoga therapy space, where we are often considered medical adjacent. And there's this tension that has been built up between the idea of us making a living and that of us being regulated in any way. And I, for one, am kind of concerned that we've lost the plot. I wanted to address our thoughts and worries about licensure from someone who might be thinking differently than most of us, myself included. And one of my favorite things about life is that often the right people pop into your sphere at just the right time. So today's guest on the podcast is exactly that human for me. I met Kris Maul earlier this year in an executive MBA-style program for small business owners. Kris's entire business centers around helping people meet standards in licensed professions. So let me repeat that. He has an entire business centered around licensing requirements for all sorts of professions that require one in the United States. And as you will hear, there are a lot of businesses that you might not think of that do need a license. So when I got talking to Kris, I decided to ask him if he would come on the podcast and talk to us about the potential benefits of licensing. A lot of folks are willing to be public about their disapproval of licensure in the yoga space, but nobody from the yoga space would actually come on my podcast and come out as decidedly for licensure. I think you're going to be super interested in what Kris has to say. Okay, but before we begin, this is the part of the intro where I remind you about a few things. First, of course, please like, subscribe, or follow, and if you love us, 5-star review the podcast from wherever you're listening. Honestly, this is such a great way to support me in my work. It helps the algorithm learn how to show the podcast to other yoga folks like us, and honestly, that just brings us closer together, which I love. And next, if you're interested in reading more about the yoga industry, including guest commentary and direct links to the articles that I'm reading currently, consider subscribing to my newsletter. I have a big announcement and pre-sale coming up for my new project that is dedicated to us, the yoga professionals, and the newsletter will be how you hear about it first. The link to that is in the show notes. And also, I'm going to do a free training on how to host lunch and learns for medical professionals and corporations next month in September 2025. So if you want to sign up, you're going to want to subscribe to the newsletter to get that registration link. And if you're listening to this podcast episode after September, there is a replay that will be available in the podcast shop, and the link to that is also in the show notes. And finally, next week, we start posting weekly episodes again. And be on the listen for a new sponsor and a new discount code from that sponsor. This sponsor has long been super supportive of us in the yoga space who are running podcasts, and I am absolutely thrilled to say that they are the first group that I get to send my new sponsorship t-shirt to. So be on the listen. I think you're going to love it. Now, let's get into it, friends. Here's my interview with Kris Maul of Higher Education Licensure Pros. Hey, friends. Welcome to Working in Yoga. Okay, so this is part of a series that I'm calling Continuing Conversations. One of the topics that we talked about a lot in my series about our yoga organizations is the topic of licensure. And so I want to introduce you an expert on that topic. Kris Maul, will you tell everybody who you are and what you do? I'm so excited.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Happy to be here. So, my name is Kris Maul, and I own a business called Higher Education Licensure Pros. We work with colleges and universities all over the country on compliance issues related to professional and occupational licensure. I've been in this particular field for about 16 years now. Started out right after law school, working for a large online university, helping them figure out this licensure stuff. And so I'm happy to be now supporting colleges and universities around the country trying to do the same thing. So I've been doing Higher Education Licensure Pros has been in existence for about 4.5 years. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about, yoga and licensure because I know this is brand new kind of conversation, or at least not maybe not new conversation, but a new potential, growth area for the profession.
Yes. Okay. So we have this long history of licensure, right? So in the 2010s, we have this major organization, the Yoga Alliance, that was kind of taking steps towards licensure. And there's another kind of branch of yoga people called yoga therapists, which I am, that is really talking about licensure now as we work in healthcare settings and higher education settings. And pretty much this whole podcast, I've had people who are willing to say we should never license ever. And I have begged people from the yoga industry to come on. I'm like, I know you're out there. Give me the other side of this equation, because how can we have a conversation if we don't know both sides? So then you and I met, and I was like, Crystal, talk to me. Like, what do you see as potential benefits just in general of licensing a profession?
Right. So there are several benefits that drive professions and occupations to kind of push for licensure in their area. Oftentimes, it does have to relate back to the ability to earn more money. So when you think about kind of healthcare and mental health related professions, it's that ability to bill insurance, right? So that you could be maybe charging more for your services if you're able to get folks health insurance to pay, and then people can utilize that health insurance and not have that as much of an out-of-pocket cost. So that could be one big benefit. I know that if you look back historically, even within like the mental health space, licensed professional counselors, for example, that is a relatively new license. Like that's been within the last 30 years. So if you think about, what was that group doing before? It was only other mental health professionals who had the license, and counselors recognized, like, hey, we want access to the same kind of insurance billing opportunities, government contracts, working with the Veterans Affairs Administration, for example. Things like that, they do generally require that the professional be licensed in order to get into those types of settings. So, first one, yeah, economic, I think, is usually a large one. And the second, which is probably almost as equally important to a lot of professions and occupations, is just the regulating of the profession of itself, if you will, right? So if you think about, right now, someone could call themselves a yoga therapist. And there might be opportunities where, like your certification body might try to stop them from doing that. But there's nothing in your state law that prevents people from just walking around and calling themselves a yoga therapist today. And then they are probably not going to ever be able to do as good of a job as someone who actually has that training and qualification and experience. So setting up a license with, again, this is something that only happens through a state government entity. So as each state would have to kind of adopt this scheme of, hey, we're going to license this profession or occupation, and then they set up what those requirements are around the education or training or experience, and then some state entity issues an actual license, right? And so there's protection in place then. If someone's walking around calling themselves a licensed something or just calling themselves a title that is licensed, they can't do that without having that correct, license and authorization from the state entity. So it's protection of the profession and occupation, making sure that only people who have the right kind of training, skills, and experience are offering those services, and providing that out to the public. Those are the two primary kind of benefits and drivers that I've seen of why occupations and professions kind of push for a state license.
Because especially number two, I think is really important for yoga therapists as a profession because a lot of people who just the yoga space, because our training is not particularly regulated, just can take 100 hours here, 200 hours there, and it's like a mishmash of stuff that you like put together, and then you're like, oh, I therapize people via yoga
Mhm.
without any real training and background. So I can you expand a little bit more on what it would do for us to protect the profession, like that number two piece that you said. I'm going to go back to number one, but let's
Mhm.
talk about number two first, because I actually think that's really important.
Yeah. So, as I was saying again, the only way that licensure is created is a state has to enact legislation that starts regulating the profession, right? So once that happens, then there is state law that exists that will say things like you can't call yourself a yoga therapist, for example, unless you have been issued this yoga therapist license by this state licensing board or agency, whoever is going to administer that. So it's it literally can become like a criminal thing in some instances if there are people out there just continuing to call themselves this thing that they're not really. So if you think about, like, I'm an attorney, and in every single state you have to be licensed in order to practice as an attorney. So if somebody just decides one day, like, hey, I think that, I've kind of watched enough Law and Order, and, I've like taken a few criminal law classes during my undergrad, I'm just gonna try it. Like, I'm just gonna call myself an attorney, hang out a shingle, see if I can attract some clients and, make a living doing this. They could try, but pretty quickly that person is going to be shut down by, the state bar for, here in Iowa where we're at, the Iowa State Bar, and is going to say, you cannot do that. You cannot call yourself an attorney. You cannot be practicing law. You can't be trying to help people with, their criminal problems because you do not have the right kind of education and training. And most importantly, you don't have a license to be an attorney in the state of Iowa. So that would apply in the same way to any, it's the same across any profession or occupation. And again, it's really about both kind of protecting and gatekeeping the profession, but most importantly to the state, it's about protecting the public, right?
Yes.
Because you really only want to have professionals who are trained in that area and have the right education and background doing that service or providing that skills or healthcare or whatever it is, because you don't want somebody to get hurt. You don't want somebody in the public to think that they're going to be signed up with this person and receiving this particular kind of support or service, and then that person doesn't know what they're doing really, and it ends up hurting that member of the public.
Talk about that word gatekeeping for a minute, because there has been a couple people that have come on the podcast and said the gatekeeping is a downside because licensure means you have to pass a particular test, which yoga therapists, we actually already have the test, like we're set up to be taking those steps, but you have to pass the test. Some people, neurodivergent folks have a hard time with test taking. There's a lot of talk about financial access with licensure, like maybe you can't afford to go through the whole process. Can we talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right, Rebecca. There are pluses and minuses to gatekeeping, just like all of the aspects of licensure here when you consider those for a profession. They're generally, like, right, as I mentioned, a state has to pass a law that says, hey, we're going to start licensing this profession. They then kind of create a licensing board that's going to oversee that, or they kind of push the responsibilities onto an existing licensing board or agency. Well, somebody has to pay for that new work, right? That licensing board needs to do, or the agency, and that's where the money piece comes in, because there are always fees associated with getting licensed, and it's a broad range. So as I mentioned, I'm a licensed attorney. We kind of fall on the higher end of the range as far as what we have to pay every year to renew our licenses, in addition to that kind of initial license application fee. Other professions are less, but it's still not insignificant. So we can be talking about anywhere from like a couple $100s on that initial license application phase, and then maybe $50 a year to renew or something like that, would be kind of towards the lower end of the range that I see across occupations and professions. Or you could be up to thousands of dollars for that initial license, and then hundreds each year just to renew, not counting any continuing education requirements, which we can talk more about that if you want to. That's kind of a separate
Yes, I
thing.
do.
But so that does provide that does create some barriers, but also keep in mind the first thing I mentioned, right, is often with a license comes the ability to earn more based on the fact that you're now a licensed professional. So whether you can just charge more simply because you are licensed now and you have more expenses you have to deal with, right? Or I think the biggest hook is generally, again, for insurance purposes, especially for something like yoga and yoga therapy in particular, where, there definitely is a connection with medical treatment, mental health treatment, that kind of thing. So the gatekeeping piece, I'd say in the plus side of the column, as I was talking about, it's going to prevent people that really don't have that same kind of knowledge and skills and experience from really tainting your brand, if you will, right? So if you're a licensed yoga therapist, there's not going to be the opportunity for people to be out there calling themselves yoga therapists who aren't up to the same standard as you. And so that is going to keep out, again, something that would really dilute the skills and services and care that you can provide as a licensed professional, because those people simply won't be able to do it anymore. They can be, you know, again, it ultimately can become a criminal thing depending on the level.
Yes.
But if nothing else, they would just be, receiving letters from the licensing board of, hey, you can't do this, you need to stop. If people continue doing it, that's when it becomes a criminal thing ultimately. So
Okay, so let's talk about the money piece, since I definitely don't want to forget about that. Yoga in general has a what I call a poverty issue. It's not even a money issue, it's a poverty issue, and the expectation that we're supposed to live in poverty and that somehow makes us like better at yoga, which is just absurd considering the amount of thousands of dollars I paid for my education.
hmm hmm
But so like I've had people come on and say that's kind of a myth. You're really not going to make that much more money if you're able to bill insurance. Like, true? False? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I'm definitely not an expert on healthcare billing and
Yeah.
that type of thing. So there may be people that have better insight into the exact dollar amount that you could expect, to increase or not based on that. But again, I will just point back to other examples of licensed professions where once they achieved a license, and I'm going to go back to counselors because, again, professional counselors is relatively new when compared to
Yes.
things like licensed psychologists or social workers or things like that. Once counselors were able to achieve licensure for themselves as licensed professional counselors, it unlocked new doors for them, right? So, like I mentioned, being able to work for Department of Veterans Affairs, like that was not possible for counselors until they achieved licensure, and then it actually took a little bit of time after that. But point is that there are certain opportunities that may not be available today to yoga therapists, that could be in the future if you were a licensed profession. And so that would be kind of a new stream of income potentially, right? If you're able to work with different government agencies, or work in different settings that you haven't been able to because you simply aren't licensed yet at this point. And then the health insurance piece, I mean, I do understand, I'm sure that there's overhead that comes along with trying to process insurance and all of those things. But I do think, just thinking about like my own experiences, if you're going to be seeking out some sort of mental or physical healthcare support, like being able to utilize insurance as a consumer to do that, I'm much more likely to do it, right? Like I'm
Yeah.
already paying my insurance premiums, and so if I can like go try something chiropractic, for example, right? Like
Yep.
my plan covers chiropractic, and that makes me personally much more likely to go try it, even if it's something that I maybe normally wouldn't if I just had to pay totally out of pocket. So I think, for yoga therapy, it could open up a whole new set of potential customers, potential clients, because people could access their insurance benefits, which would make it more affordable to them as that consumer. Um, and so there's a trade-off, right?
Yeah.
Opening up new opportunity to new customers, new clients. But yes, you probably are going to have more overhead costs with trying to figure out how to process that insurance and all of the things that come along with that.
Sort of, we could go back to that gatekeeping or accessibility piece of like, yes, it might make it harder to be a yoga therapist, but it also for the general public makes this wildly more accessible for us to come. Like I cost $150 an
Hmm.
hour and I live in a 450,000 person town in Iowa. Like
Hmm.
imagine what people are paying in New York City or in LA or Denver or Atlanta, wherever where cost of living so much higher.
Yep.
Like who could afford us out of pocket except people who have wealth and who are on the higher end of like, the capitalism spectrum, shall we say. Like
Yeah.
it would make us wildly more accessible.
Yep, absolutely. I think you're right about that for sure. And again, it's kind of like whose needs or whose benefits do you ultimately want to prioritize, right? Like, are
Yeah.
you are you looking purely at, okay, what is this going to do for us as yoga therapists, or even for me as an individual yoga therapist, versus what kind of impact is it going to have on our broader community, on our country, on the world, like all of those things. And so I think you're right, Rebecca. It's uh, definitely thinking about the gatekeeping versus access and who's going to benefit through each of those things.
Yeah. So another like kind of objection, I'm kind of going through objections that I have heard either in conversation or people have come and talked about them on the podcast. But another sort of objection is that we actually, as yoga professionals, don't hold enough of a risk to public health for us to even be able to gain licensure. Like who's, the question of like who's getting injured in yoga, so to speak.
Mhm.
Um, what are your thoughts there? Have you seen other professions try and license and fail because they didn't prove that they were part of, that they were a potential harm to the public?
Hmm. Yeah, so that is an important consideration for any license type. Typically, is a state is going to ask that question, right? Like, what is the potential harm to a member of the public if something goes wrong with this service or this skill or whatever it is? So I couldn't find any like close related examples of something to yoga where there's been a push and it wasn't successful. It doesn't mean it hasn't been out there. I just couldn't find it in my little
Yeah.
bit of prep for this. But I will say that there are a lot of occupations and professions that are currently licensed that you wouldn't necessarily think like, oh, that presents a lot of risk to public safety or welfare. So, for example, like landscape architecture. Landscape architecture, that's a licensed profession in a lot of states. Yeah, like you have to be licensed to be a landscape architect. And so you can maybe think through some scenarios where, like, well, if someone doesn't know what they're doing, maybe they're going to like plant an invasive species and then that's going to take over. I mean, I don't know, right? It's hard to kind of draw that direct line between an actual impact on a individual person's safety or welfare to a landscape architect. So I think it doesn't always have to be that obvious or that direct of a link to still make sense. And again, ultimately it would be up to each state to figure out if they want to license a profession or not. And some won't. So landscape architecture, again, not every state requires a license for that. Some do. Another example of that is like interior design. That's another one where I'm like, okay, what's that direct connection to, public health and safety? It's kind of hard to imagine what that is, but somebody came up with potential bad outcomes for the public, and thought that that was enough to create a license. So there are a handful of states that license interior designers, and other states have chosen not to. So I kind of imagine for any occupation or profession, the typical flow is either there's like a state or two where you start to see an occupation or profession be licensed, and it's kind of, I would call that more of like an organic growth that starts happening, and then maybe other states adopt it as well, and so you'll see kind of a growth that way. Other times it is the profession itself that decides, hey, we want to be licensed, and this is what happened with professional counselors. And so they come together through their associations, and other groups, and kind of start advocating and lobbying at states to say, we want to be licensed. Here's the criteria that we believe would reflect well on, the education and training and experience. And so that profession then kind of creates the standards, and may have to make that link, that connection with public safety as part of their lobbying efforts at the states.
Yeah. Okay. So then let's say we do get licensed. Who's then like who decides? This is a bit like yoga because of our history, right? So we are living in the United States of America. This was not our land. Yoga was not our practice, right? So primarily it's a bunch of white folks taking a practice that started in Southeast Asia or India and was brought to the United States. So there's a lot of conversation amongst us about like who decides what yoga is? Like, so then this is us choosing to be more formalized with our profession, right? Somebody has to decide, but then who is in charge of the yoga, so to speak? Is it the states? Is it our organizations? Like, who gets
Mhm.
to make those choices?
Yeah, so for different professions and occupations, it is set up differently, really, depending on, again, I think kind of those factors of it, if it was like a kind of more organic, stemmed from a state idea, or if it was something that was coming from the profession or occupation itself to drive licensure. So there are options, right? A state could decide that they are going to tie the education and training requirements directly to an external entity, let's say an accreditor,
Yeah,
right? So in that instance, then whatever the accreditor does as far as, changing those education or training requirements or updating things, that's all kind of baked into the state requirements, if you will, because the state licensure law would say, in order to qualify as a yoga therapist, you need to present us with this education and training that's been accredited by this external organization. Like we see that often in lots of different license types where the license is directly connected to an accreditor. I will
yeah,
say there are some downsides to that. So, as
yeah,
somebody who worked for a large online university for a number of years, um, in the higher education world, like just traditionally, there's kind of been some bias against online education. So there were certain kind of specialized accreditors who would not accredit online universities. One example is the American Psychological Association, the APA. And for someone to qualify for a license as a licensed psychologist in a large number of states, you need to graduate from an APA accredited program. So in that example, right, it effectively shuts out anybody who would want to pursue a psychology program in an online kind of setting because the APA won't accredit those degrees. So it is kind of thinking through like there's a lot of opportunity and maybe more simplicity, like tying the education and training standards to an external accreditor, but then everything becomes so a lot reliant on that accreditor,
Yeah.
and kind of what's happening there and the politics and everything else that's going on at the accreditor, which can then close the door for some people who would otherwise, be qualified to be licensed. It's just maybe through a different pathway. So it does get complicated. Back to your original question, Rebecca, like who decides? I mean, the shortest answer to that is it would ultimately be up to the state licensing board or agency that will be issuing that particular license. Like, and so they can set their own education and training standards that have nothing to do with whatever accreditors exist at the time that the license is created. I've seen this in lots of other license types as well. So even using the psychologist example, while many states are aligned and require APA, there are some states that just kind of totally went, they're just their own direction. So if you want to qualify as a licensed psychologist in that state, you need to produce a transcript, of courses and clinical training that has like a whole laundry list of things on it. And so that licensing board or agency is just literally going through and checking off a person's transcript. Do you have this number of credits in this? Do you have this many number of hours of clinical training that was supervised in this? And doing that comparison. And it's not aligned with what the specialized accreditor is doing. So it's up to that particular state licensing board or agency to decide what those education and training requirements are for the most part, unless it's like built in with the legislation that gets passed in the first place. And that sometimes happens, especially if it's a connection to the accrediting agency.
Need to extrapolate this point here. It's just in my head, and I'm just going to say it out loud so that anybody listening could put this in their back pocket, right? So we have what would be an accrediting body, the IOIT, International Association of Yoga Therapists. Let's say we don't like them. We could potentially lobby directly to our states, and we would then be able to set the standards. And we could say fuck all to the IOIT and their organization because we could license without them, is what you're saying is potentially true.
Yes, that is absolutely true. You could say, we want to, we believe outside of whatever that accreditor is doing, like we believe as yoga therapists here in the state of Iowa that it would be beneficial for us to be licensed. And here are the education and training standards that we believe are needed to be a successful, qualified, helpful yoga therapist. And it could be totally different than what the accreditor is doing. It could be, similar with a few minor changes, whatever. And that could be part of the actual legislation that is being trying to be passed through the Iowa or whatever state legislature. It could be that specific where you're listing like X number of hours of training in this and X number of hours of training in that. It sometimes is that specific for some of these occupations and professions, or sometimes it's more general where you just kind of say, here are like the rough parameters, and then ultimately it would be whatever licensing board or agency that gets created after the bill gets passed by the state of Iowa to create licensing for this. Then the state licensing board or agency would set the education and training standards at that point.
Really interesting. I mean, one of the biggest issues that we have in the yoga space, particularly, is it's like there's 12 people with all the power, and none of the rest of us who actually do the work get any say in where the profession is going. So, that is an interesting bit of information that we could potentially bypass the organization and do the work ourselves, should we so choose and so organize. Like, that's really exciting, Kris.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing that with me.
Yeah, you're welcome. I will say, like, kind of thinking through the mechanics of this, like, I think folks should be prepared that it does require like a lobbying effort to your state legislature, right?
Yeah.
And able to be successful in this. And so the first thing I would say, my partner actually does advocacy for a living, so I'm channeling her right now. Like, what would she tell them about advocacy? But if you don't already know who your elected officials are for your state legislature,
Yep.
You should know who they are 100%. You should be emailing and calling them at a minimum, especially if there's any issues relevant, to your work in yoga, as we're talking about this specifically. If you're kind of gearing up to see if it would be possible to push for a yoga therapist license in your state, like you're going to need to have connections, even personal connections, with some legislators who can help with this. So, in particular, if this is like a brand new thing, which it is for this professional occupation, it's going to require a lot of education, explaining why this is something that is needed in the state and why it's a good thing for the state people. And so, having those personal relationships established already before it's time to do like the full on push for this license is going to be completely invaluable. So if you don't already know who your state elected officials are representing you, figure out who are every state has a website. You can look it up based on your address, send them a quick email and say, hey, I'm a yoga therapist. This is what I'm interested in. If you ever have any questions about it, please, reach out to me. I'm happy to talk. And of course, I would encourage everyone to be doing this anyway all the time for any kind of issue that you care about that's impacting you and your family and your neighbors in your state. But for sure, to prepare for the push that would be required to try to get a profession licensed, you're going to need to have some good, solid connections at your state government to do that.
Advice ever. Also, Kris, I knew that we would be friends, but really now I'm like, oh my God, Kris and I are going to be best friends. That's such good advice.
Yeah.
That's really great advice. Okay, so let's take this down the path. Let's say things go well. We become licensed. We're now licensed healthcare professionals as yoga therapists. What happens next? What do we have to do to keep our license? What sort of things do we have to be thinking about as we're going down the professional path?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier continuing education, right?
Yeah.
So, as a licensed attorney, that is something that I do either on an annual basis or every few years. I have to report to a state where I'm licensed. I have completed X number of hours of continuing education. So, like for me, for example, it's 15 hours a year in Iowa that I have to complete. And there are kind of some, specificity within that, a certain number of hours of different things. I'm also licensed as an attorney in Minnesota. And for that, they say you need to report to us every 3 years and show us you've done 45 hours. So kind of equates to the same thing, but just, different kind of reporting mechanics that those state boards have set up. So for most professions and occupations, especially in kind of the healthcare, mental health care related space, there is continuing education that's required on a periodic basis. And so, in some instances, that continuing education is something that you may already be doing. That's just going to now need to become part of this whole formal licensing board or agency structure, right? So typically, a board or agency will approve the continuing education in some way. So there could be a connection to, again, an accrediting body of some sort or a national association that exists for the profession or something like that. Like if they are already doing things related to continuing education, the board might just adopt like, hey, show us that you have completed 10 hours of continuing ed this year from this accredited organization or from this particular national association, whatever it is. In other instances, like individual continuing education has to be submitted to the licensing board or agency for approval. So again, that would be kind of another process that gets set up when this license type would be created and when the board would be established is how they're going to handle, continuing education. And I would say as a profession to obviously be thinking about that. Like it seems to me like someone like a yoga therapist, there would continuing education would be something required. Like you wouldn't want someone to get licensed and like never go to another workshop or training or seminar for 10, 15 years and they're still out there practicing the same stuff that they learned a decade ago. Obviously, things have probably changed. There are better ways of doing it. So that would want to be part of kind of this whole equation of what do we think is required as professionals to kind of maintain that excellent level of care for our clients, for our customers as a yoga therapist, and then build that in. to the legislation that you would be trying to get passed at states around this. Um, in addition to the continuing education, as I mentioned before, too, there's usually like a renewal fee itself, and you have to kind of reapply to renew that license on some cycle, either on an annual basis or every 2 or 3 years, whatever it is, and that can vary greatly. There are some professions and occupations that do have things like background checks as well. We haven't talked about this yet, but this is another kind of access issue potentially. So when you think about like nurses, for example, in order for someone to be a registered nurse, in every state, they do require a criminal background check, and they do have in virtually all states, very specific criteria. Like if you have been convicted of certain types of crimes, then you are ineligible for a registered nurse license. And that for various professions and occupations, is kind of the same. And so that's something else to think about. Like if there would be some reason or connection into that, and if it's something that the profession would want to include, obviously, again, that can be kind of a gatekeeping thing in a positive, but also maybe a negative way, right? Depending on like how that is ultimately set up and administered.
See this. Are there professions that there is a license associated with the profession where some of the professionals are licensed and others are not? And the difference is mainly where they can work. Like you would have to be a licensed so and so, underwater basket weaver to be able to underwater basket weave in hospitals and higher education. But if you wanted to be an independent contractor, underwater basket weaver, you wouldn't need a license. Is that like a thing, or have I just made that up in my head?
No, that's definitely a thing. That is definitely a thing. So there are instances where the license is, and typically I've seen this more in like the healthcare space, and it's related to working in a particular type of healthcare facility. So, right, like one that gets state funding or federal funding
Yeah.
or whatever it is. And in order to qualify for that, then a person needs to have this particular license. Sometimes it's called something else, like a registration or authorization, but it
Yeah.
functions as a license in the same way. So that is definitely an option. Another thing to think of is like in the P through 12 education space. So in a lot of instances, in states, if you want to work in a private P through 12 setting, you may not need to hold a teaching license to do that, or you may not need to have the same type of teaching license to teach the thing that you would have to hold to teach in public school, which is maybe not necessarily a good thing, but that's how it's set up. So there definitely are those kind of differences in settings and workplaces that can play into who needs a license, and that would be specified in again the enabling legislation for that particular type of professional occupation, or within the rules or regulations that the licensing board creates itself.
One profession I didn't want you to use as an example of educators. I mean, like I understand because like I actually went to private school as a little kid, and so I saw that there. But man, I really want everybody to know how to teach if they're teaching our like young humans.
Yes, yeah, again, drawbacks to not having a licensed
Yeah,
professional doing the work, because again the license was created for some reason in the first place by your
yeah,
state, and the standards were set at the way they were for a particular reason in your state. So yeah, it
yeah,
it can cause kind of inequities in the level of just care, for lack of a better word, for our kids, right?
yeah.
Like, what are they learning? And maybe it's not quite up to the same standards. So
Let's talk briefly before we go about the mechanics of the licensing in general. So, like, two questions here. One, how long, like, let's say I wanted to gather my yoga therapist friends in Iowa and said, hey, we're going to be the first state in the country to license yoga therapists. How long do you think that journey would take? Is my first question. And my second question is once hopefully we were successful, right? The board would be like how many people and like what the mechanics of like running a board of licensed professionals would be. So those two questions.
yeah. So your first question, how long would it take? this is like a total lawyer answer, but I'm really just going to say it depends. So, and I think it truly does depend on some of the factors I was talking about earlier, like what kind of relationships already exist at that state
Yeah.
with, yoga therapists and some elected officials. Like if you had a handful of legislators that personally already knew yoga therapists in the state and there had already been some education and conversations, then it's possible that I think somebody could do a push and within a couple of years have a successful campaign. If there's not that level of kind of personal relationship or connections or education that's already happened, then we're probably talking more like, 4 or 5 plus years, because it will take time to kind of lay that groundwork that's required. And the licensing board itself, so this is something that also will depend on the legislation. So the legislation would either create a new licensing board or agency. I'll tell you, in Iowa, that would be a horrible idea, because in the past several years, they've consolidated a lot of existing licensing boards and like put them together. So I would recommend, for whatever that's worth, if you're in Iowa or if you're in any other number of Republican controlled states at this point, because that's just where the trend has been, that you would want to figure out an existing licensing board or agency that it would make sense to have your profession regulated in. And so, what if it's a new board? Then there would be kind of the framework established again within the legislation of how many members would be on that board, how many of those board members would need to be yoga therapists. Like that's always an important piece here, is it
Yeah.
is kind of a self governing still thing for the profession or occupation. There's always a certain number of people within that profession that need to be part of the board itself. And then you're also going to have public members, and others that are part of the licensing board. If you're coming into an existing licensing board, typically what will happen is like they will adjust the seats on the board so that a yoga therapist would then become part of it. So, like, let's say you're joining the same board that licenses, I'm just making this up, right? But like chiropractors and, other kind of related healthcare supportive professions, like you would get a seat on that board and there might be like 12 other people, but only one would be designated for yoga therapists and then one for the other professions and then members of the public. So um, it is kind of an interesting time because there's like this push in many states to try to like deregulate some professions and occupations, or like I said, to combine the boards themselves. And really that push is just trying to increase efficiency and decrease cost for the state government. That's why they're combining boards and agencies. It's not necessarily in the best interest of the profession or in the best interest of the public, maybe, but it's an effort to reduce costs at the state level to administer these. So I think I answered your question. Anything else on that I missed?
No, actually, that was actually very interesting. It went further than I thought. Like I didn't know, and like for the state of Iowa, for example, a wildly red state until next year when Rob Sand gets elected governor. Um, we'll just put that out there, fingers crossed. That they were consolidating boards. Like I honestly didn't know how that works. So that's really interesting how that kind of all comes together.
Mhm. Yeah, and so again, kind of depending on the particular state and like the approach to this advocacy campaign to try to get the license created, it would also make sense to have relationships with those existing, boards
Yeah.
or professions within them. So if it is like, hey, we think it would make sense to fit within this board that also license, chiropractors and whoever else, like definitely want to be reaching out to the chiropractors who are on the board and like the state association probably for chiropractors, because once something gets to the capital, then it's like people might come out of the woodwork to oppose something. And so
Yeah.
the more you can kind of try to lay that good groundwork and have conversations ahead of time, again, usually the more successful your advocacy efforts will be.
So then if we get licensed within a state, say, does each state then have its own association within the state for that profession, typically speaking?
So each state would definitely have to have its own licensing board or agency. The association itself is typically outside of
Okay.
the state. Something that is like a private nonprofit typically, right? And I think there are at least a couple of national organizations right now for yoga therapists and yoga teachers too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so do they have state chapters right now?
No, they don't. And we have two potentially by the time this airs, there will be a third. But
Okay.
yeah, so there's no state chapters. It's very difficult to organize yoga people. We are like, I mean, we're hippies and counterculture people at heart, so it's difficult to organize us.
Yeah. Yeah. I get that. I get that. Um, there always is the possibility of creating your own kind of state association first, or maybe in conjunction with trying to become licensed. So an association typically is going to be obviously a voluntary kind of member organization. And obviously there would need to be like a board of that because it's going to be a
Yes.
nonprofit type of thing. But oftentimes it is those state associations or the national associations with state chapters that are kind of driving like the advocacy efforts to get a license created in particular
Yeah.
states. So I'll kind of again echo back to the counseling example. Like there's national organization of counselors, and they had state chapters in various states, and I think those kind of state chapters were instrumental in helping create and pass licensed professional counselor laws in a number of states because they had that kind of structure and organization in place already.
Very helpful. That's a really interesting way to go about it because actually, I mean, we could all create state associations and then within us decide that we wanted to do it or not. So I feel like that's super helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it ever hurts to try to create some sort of people power, right? And like that's what an
Yeah.
association would do, is whether or not you ever decide to seek licensure, like even just having an association could be very helpful for different things in the future. Like maybe you don't get licensed, but maybe there is something that can be done to help, like expand opportunities to work within your state government funded agencies or organizations or something like that. And so having the association, again, it's kind of that central source of power. You can do organizing of your people and, show up to the Capitol and try to lobby for whatever you're asking
Yeah.
your legislator to do.
Okay, that's very exciting. Okay, so Kris, will you tell everybody how to get a hold of you? So specifically, will you tell the International Association of Yoga Therapists, which I know you're listening, hello, IOIT, how to get a hold of you so that you can give them advice on how to do this for us as a profession?
Sure, absolutely. I always love talking to anyone about anything related to professional occupational licensure. As I said, I've been doing this for quite a while, and I'm happy to be doing it most directly with colleges and universities right now. But I'm always happy to talk to anybody about these issues. So you can find me through our website, which is www.higheredlicensurepros.com. You can also email me directly, Kris, that's Kris, at higheredlicensurepros.com.
That's brilliant. So I really want the Yoga X program at Stanford. Hello, if you're listening, to talk to Kris so that you all can have this conversation. So you can have like nurturing and fruitful discussions about licensure because I think we really need to have them. Thank you so much for saying yes. You were the only one who said yes, and you were the perfect match for this conversation. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Happy to do it. Thanks.
Okay, this was such an interesting and fruitful conversation. Thank you so much, Kris. Here are our key takeaways. First, Kris's comments on gatekeeping were one of my favorites in this entire discussion. We often discuss licensing and gatekeeping of the profession in a bad way, when the reality is there are some gates that should perhaps be kept closed. I found this out ages ago when I first trained to be a yoga therapist in around 2010. There was someone else in my community who did a training that wasn't a yoga therapy training, but advertised themselves as doing, quote unquote, therapeutic yoga. And we need some sort of way to differentiate between those two terms in a meaningful way. Now, conversely, the idea of gatekeeping those who have neurodivergence or don't do well in test taking materials or the financial access of a licensure, I don't love. I feel like there must be ways to make a professionalization accessible to folks who want to participate while also allowing for some kind of differentiation between yoga therapists and yoga teachers who claim to operate therapeutically. Next, public protection, public protection, public protection. A license would offer some kind of public protection for folks who might be victims of mistreatment at the hands of a yoga therapist. At the moment, our reality is that someone could suffer abuse of the worst kind from a yoga professional, and that person could move towns, start over again with no professional recourse whatsoever. Only if the police are involved would any recourse happen at all. And that is wild for me to say, I have to be honest. How are we accepting that as our reality? I know intellectually that we as a collective care about the welfare of our students and clients, and we want to make sure that they're safe, but our professional life does not reflect that care or concern at all. Next, being able to accept insurance would make our services more accessible to the general public, and that is undeniable. But that does not mean that we should accept insurance, at least not until we are able to convey fully what our work is and have a clear understanding of how we can work within an insurance system. For my mind, I think that the issues of should we be licensed and the issue of should we take insurance are separate and should be taken as two parts of a greater whole, not the whole thing altogether. And next, dovetailing off that last takeaway, I don't think that a lot of folks who are against licensure, not all, but many, think of clients in a way that I feel comfortable about. It's sort of in a sorry about your luck kind of way. Now, we do need to get paid, and you all know that I am the first and biggest advocate for us getting paid. And we do need to sort out the money part of our challenges as an industry before we can take on the idea of being financially accessible to other populations in full. But right now, we seem to be split into two camps. Into one camp that I'm calling the sorry about your luck camp, and those are the folks who advise you to go for only high-end clients so that you can pay your bills, and the self-sacrifice camp, and those are the folks who believe that financially we should suffer in order to help others. And I don't know about you, but I would love at least a third option here, because both of those choices kind of suck. We've spent way too much money in our education to only have those two choices. And finally, my last key takeaway, and I wrote the first sentence in all caps, is we need to decenter the orgs. The work that we should do should be centered around we, the professionals. Now, nothing says this more clearly than the recent hiring of the new executive director of the International Association of Yoga Therapists, who has never been a yoga professional. The Yoga Alliance's executive director has also never been a yoga professional. This would be like hiring someone outside of farming to run a farmers cooperative. The result of that decision might be policies may benefit corporate interests instead of actual farmers. Or it could be like hiring a non-teacher to lead a teachers union. The result of that would be, without that classroom experience, decisions for the teachers union may be divorced from the daily realities of what it is to teach. Or worse still, it would be like hiring a non-scientist to head a scientific research body like the FDA. A policy and funding decisions from that organization might risk being uninformed or politically motivated. And guess what? We in the United States have a front row seat in seeing how that is going firsthand. It is wild to believe that someone who is removed from and has never even come close to making a living in our industry for that matter is in charge of $1 million or multi-million-dollar organization. How would they understand the realities that yoga therapists struggle with daily without the lived experience of being a yoga professional? I don't care how many people you ask for their opinions, it's not the same. And it is super sad to me that the IOIT's board members don't take us and our work seriously enough as professionals to even hire someone from our own profession to lead us. So you know what? Let's make them matter less. We, the collective, will find a better way to work for us. Together. Fuck them. We don't need them anyways. Next week on the podcast comes Gina Ward, a studio owner and yoga teacher trainer who ran some data about the realities of yoga studio owner businesses and is sharing her findings with us. If you're curious about how yoga studios work and what the realities of owning those businesses are like, you're definitely going to want to take a listen. Until then, I am so grateful that you have chosen to spend your time with me, my friends. Let's go get to work, and I'll catch you around the water cooler next time.